Come on. We all survived the solar eclipse yesterday, so we can be excited to be here. I've heard a lot about what was happening on TikTok yesterday. I don't have TikTok because I wouldn't get anything done. But I'm excited. If this is your first night at Overflow, my name is Carson, and it is such a gift to be with you. It is crazy to me that we only have 2 more nights of Overflow after tonight. Tonight is one of 3. Boo is the answer to that, 100%. But we are coming into a strong finish. Mark chapter 13, do the math. There's 16 chapters in Mark. We're going to cover a lot of ground over the next couple of weeks because we're going to get to the end of Mark chapter 16. That is a promise. I am giving it to you right now. I have no idea how I'm going to pull it off, but I'm just promising it to you in advance. But tonight, the title of the message, if you're taking notes, I would just love for you to write it down because there's a lot of technical parts of the message tonight. There's a lot of things that you might walk away feeling maybe a little bit more confused than you may have felt like that you arrived tonight. And that's okay because I want you to ask questions. I want you to press into the deep end. But I do think that this topic matters. I think it matters to you. I think it matters to me. I think it matters to maybe your future spouse, to your future kids, because if we don't get this right, we're going to miss out on some really, really important things. Some really important things that their return address is heaven. It's the God of all creation. So the title of the message tonight is From Okay to God's Best. From okay, from mediocre, from ordinary to God's best. Because God has a best version of life for you. God has a best version of reality for you. God has a best version of you, the way that you go about living your life. He has the best habits, the best ways, the best words, the best conversation habits for you. And I think a lot of times we live in a okay culture where we just try to get to the status quo. Or we settle with just feeling okay. And then all of a sudden, that becomes our priority. Where it's like, at least if I can just feel okay, or if I can feel decent about this. Let's put it in this context of school. If I can just get a decent grade, then I'll pass. That might work in college because C's do get degrees, thank the Lord. But, or else I wouldn't have a degree. That's a whole, I get stuck there. But it's really bad theology because God has a best for you. It's in his mind. He prepared it for you in advance. And for me, this really came right into the front of my eyes a couple of weeks ago. My wife and I were talking about just our future and our daughter who's going to be here in August, our second daughter named Porter. We did land on a name, Porter Wren. We're really excited, and we were just talking about how our life's going to change because we have an almost 2-year-old who is just into everything right now. She tears our house completely apart every single day. She actually, by accident, kicked me in the eye this weekend, and I had a black eye, and no joke. But we're like talking about just like how are we going to navigate having 2 kids? And my wife came to the conclusion that she was going to step back from her job, and she's going to spend some time at home with our kids. And I remember in that moment feeling so excited for our family. Because I'm like, I'll be able to see my wife a little bit more. She's going to have more capacity to invest in our kids. But on the other hand, I was absolutely and still am a little bit terrified because our income is going to be cut in half. I'm just being real with you. Okay, so I'm just sitting here thinking, well, what are we going to do? And the thought pops into my mind, I'll figure it out and we'll be okay. And God convicted me in that moment of going, 1, you're discrediting me and you're selling me a little bit short. By saying that it's just going to be okay, you've counted me out. And also by you saying that you're going to figure it out, you've taken this whole situation into your own hands. And you set the vision, Carson, for just trying to be okay. Well, Jesus never tells us that we're going to give or live an okay life by the world's standards of okay. He promises us God's best for us, but he does not promise us to live by the world's definition, an okay version of life. And the way that I have just been seeing this illustrated is a couple of months into our daughter Lennon's life, I remember I spent many nights sitting beside her crib as she was trying to go to sleep because she wasn't allowed to have anything in her crib. Guys, if you just keep coming to Overflow, I'm going to teach you how to be a dad, okay? I didn't know a lot of these things. I knew none of these things. I didn't know how to change a diaper. I put the diaper on backwards in the hospital. My mother-in-law had to flip the whole baby around. But anyway, so I'm sitting at the crib, and the room is completely pitch black dark. I can't see my hand in front of my face. Lennon is sitting in here. She's got her what she calls a pabu. I don't know where it came from, but it's what it's called. And she would spit it out, and it would fall out of the crib. And I remember just sitting there hour after hour after hour, just putting the pabu back in her mouth. And then she gets a little bit older, because the pabu, guys, not singling you guys out, Overflow. The pabu is what was making her feel okay so that she could fall asleep. Follow me here. She gets a little bit older, and we were able to introduce what we call stuffies into the equation. So this was a game changer because then she'd be sitting in the crib. Yeah, it's shoes on the sheets. It's okay. When I did it with a full-size bed, you guys cringed. It's okay. This is bouncy. Hey, I put this together last night. It's okay. This is actually Porter's crib. But she would sit in her bed, and when she didn't want to go to sleep, when she was over it, what she would do is she would have at least 10 stuffed animals with her. She'd just chuck them out. So we would come into her room, and she would just be sitting here, bouncing up and down, and on the floor was all these different stuffed animals. And she'd be looking down, going like, oh no, what have I done? Like, all the things that were supposed to make me feel okay, I can't reach them. And the thing that I want us to understand tonight is a lot of us are holding Mickey Mouse. We're holding these things that make us feel okay, but the thing that Lennon really wanted was her mom and dad in the room with her. This was just a stopgap. This was just to help her feel okay in the moment so that she could get to sleep. And for you and for me, we're doing this relentlessly in our life. We're holding on to things that make us feel okay that are actually keeping us separated from God's best. Because we're holding on to status. We're holding on to the financial future that we think that we're going to have. We're holding on to our degree, seniors. You're graduating here soon, and you're holding on to the fact that you're going to have a degree hanging on the wall, and that's going to make you okay. A lot of you, you're holding on to the fact that our country is what it is, or the church believes what it believes, or your parents are doing what they're doing, or your parents are maybe paying your bills. Hello. And you're like, what makes you feel okay is your parents' security. And I'm not making an argument against anything that I just mentioned. But the point is tonight, as long as we are holding tightly on to the things of this world that make us feel okay, we're going to miss God's best for us. Because God's best is only found in God's presence. Just like Lennon's best version of reality is us being in her room with her, the best version of reality that we will ever live is life with God. And yes, I'm going to get out of the crib in just a moment, but it takes a second. When you think about this, though, what do you need to throw out? What are you relying on in your life right now that is not helping you get any closer to God's best for you? Because my concern for us as a generation is that we believe that Jesus just wants us to be okay in life. And Jesus doesn't just want us to be okay. Jesus wants us to experience God's best for us. So if you have your Bible, we're going to jump to Mark chapter 13. If you have your Bible, you can hold it up in the air real quick. We got 3 more weeks of holding our Bibles up in the air. Yes, oh my goodness, I love this so much. Bring your Bible every week. And if you don't have one, we will give you one tonight. Mark chapter 13, I get really, really excited about us like learning together and looking at God's written word together. and exploring it. And we're going to cover a lot of ground tonight. I'm going to abbreviate a lot of things. And if you've got questions, please come down right here, like right there after, and talk to me, because I would love nothing more than to build a new friendship. But Mark chapter 13, verse 1, begins this long line of 37 verses, 35 verses of prophecy. And Jesus is saying some things that have got the disciples rattled. And I would say, if you grew up reading the Bible, you might have read this before, and this has rattled you because of the way that you've read it. And to be fair, there's gonna be part of us that is a little bit rattled tonight because of some of the things that we read and that we uncover. But we've just gotta commit for the next 24 minutes to stay together. It's gonna get a little complicated, but I promise I'm gonna bring us out at the very end. Everybody ready? Mark chapter 13, verse 1. It says, as Jesus was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings." It's like the disciples are like, Dad, look at this place. Look at how cool this place it is. And look at what Jesus responds with. Do you see all these great buildings? You got to think, the disciples are like, hey, dude, or hey, Lord, we just pointed the buildings out. You don't have to ask us. But Jesus, when he asks a question, he's always setting you up to understand something that's really, really important. He goes on to say, not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down. And you think about this, it's like this magnificent display. We talked about this last week of how the people in the synagogue and the teachers and the rulers of the law would just kind of parade themselves around, and they were committed to their status and they were committed to their acclaim. And the temple system had been broken. We learned about that on Easter, where Jesus comes in and he flips over the tables because people are using the temple system to take advantage of people, especially the people with the lowest income and the lowest opportunity. And Jesus is like, this is not what my Father's house is intended to. And Jesus actually at another point in the text says that something greater than the temple is here, which would have been heretical in every sense in the religious time, in the religious practice of that day. And he's saying, check this out. This is all about to get torn down. And I think for us, this is such an accurate representation of what our life looks like. We build all of these magnificent structures in our life, believing that that's going to make us feel okay. But we've actually just built them in the name of self-preservation, which is what the temple system was. It was a bunch of the elite people in the culture that had taken a beautiful thing that God had inhabited at one point in history and turned it into a mechanism of self-preservation in their life. Where have you, just for a second, just consider this, where have you constructed things solely for the purpose of self-preservation? Because the truth and the reality is you can't follow Jesus fully as long as self-preservation is your motive. Because Jesus is the one who said you've got to learn how to deny yourself. You've got to follow me to the cross in order to experience the fruit and the goodness of my life and resurrection. And the reason that this prophecy is so significant, we're going to jump into a little bit of history here for a minute, so just hang on tight really, really quick. The temple was huge. It was developed recently. It had been remodeled by Herod the Great. And if you've studied history, you know way more than I do, and you're probably way smarter than I am. It doesn't take much. But Herod the Great was famous for his architectural prowess. And one of the big things and his crown jewel of all the things that he had been building and working on was the temple. It actually started kind of being remodeled about 19 years before Jesus was born, and it carried on until about 63 or 64 AD after Jesus had been killed and resurrected. And when you look at all the facts, it consumed about 37 acres of land. It was a sixth of the Jerusalem city complex. If you think about this, 37 acres, and you compare it to the United States Capitol building, we have a picture in case you forgot, that is only 16 acres. So think about this for a second. The temple that the disciples are marveling at and the temple that Jesus is predicting is going to be destroyed and stone over stone is double the size of the United States Capitol. And Jesus is like, yeah, it's a teardown. It's all about to go away. To which you've got to think, generationally speaking, that's a huge claim. Because the people of Israel are like, we've waited for a temple for generations. There were generations without a temple. And like, no, there's absolutely no way that's even possible. Scholars actually referred to the temple as a mountain of marble because there were stones as big as 500 tons, what in the world? Tons that were built as the foundation of this temple. And if you've been skeptical of Jesus, if you've been skeptical of the authority of Jesus, this text is for you. Because Jesus accurately predicts the future exactly. The text goes on. And you see it in verse 3. That a little bit later in the story, as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us when these things will happen, and what will be the sign that they are all about to be fulfilled?" And Matthew actually records the same story, and he adds another piece of verbiage that I think is helpful to understanding Jesus' response. In Matthew 24, it says, as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately and tell us, they said, when this will happen and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age. Notice they tacked on another question that Matthew records. And Jesus, I think, is pointing us, he uses this as a beautiful teaching moment. I'm glad that Mark put it in the text because it exposes us and our desire and our need for certainty. The disciples are like, Jesus, you got to give us the plan. Like you got to tell us exactly how this lays out. As long as certainty is your God, you're going to miss the way of Jesus. I think a lot of the time we spend a lot of our life just searching for certainty. I want to know exactly how this is going to work out. I want to know the social security number of the person that I'm going to marry. That's creepy. Like you think about all these things that you want to know for certain. And Jesus' response, it's not exactly clear, but it is certain. Because Jesus begins uncovering some really, really important things about what is to come. But before he does it, in verse 5, he says this. Jesus said to them, this is his response to their questions. Watch out that no one deceives you. Many will come in my name claiming I am he and will deceive many. It's like, if there was any break in between that sentence and the next one, they're like, okay, we asked you a question. You didn't answer the question. We know that's your thing, but we really want an answer to the question. And I think what's true for us is there's not that many people that are claiming to be Jesus in the world today. But there are a ton of narratives that are. There's a ton of ideologies, there's a ton of statements, there's a ton of versions of truth. And the truth is what is easiest to believe is seldom the deepest truth. And Jesus is exposing that reality. Don't let anybody deceive you. Don't let anybody confuse you, even about things that are as important and as big of a deal as this. The other thing that we must know is that deception always begins with what sounds good, but just simply isn't focused on God's best. A lot of us get deceived because we hear one little thing that sounds really good, and then we automatically begin believing that there's no other way that can't be true, merely because it just sounded good to our ears. And Jesus is saying, you've got to watch out. You've got to pay attention. There's going to be many people, many narratives, many ideas that come and try to have the authority that I have. And they will deceive many. Don't let that be you. And I think that it's true in reality that it's easy to get deceived when you're focused on self-preservation. When you're focused on trying to be okay, to get to the normal version of life, to the status quo version of life, it's really, really, really easy to get deceived. And Jesus is saying, don't make that your priority because the things that are to come are intense. They are difficult. They are challenging. So if we were to sum up Mark chapter 13, verses 7 through 37, and the way that a bunch of different Christian philosophers and scholars have talked about them, I'm not going to lie to you, there's a lot of debate about what this section of text is about. There's a lot of people that believe a lot of different things, and we're going to just talk about them just for a second. And if this bores you, just hang in there with me. I promise that it's relevant. I promise we're going to make a connection to this. So there's a couple people, or not a couple people, there's some scholars and some people that believe that this whole chapter, specifically those verses 7 to 37, are only in reference to what happens in the year AD 70. And if you were to talk to a Bible scholar or a seminary geek like me, and you were to mention the year AD 70, they would probably grimace a little bit because of what happened in AD 70. In AD 70, a guy named Titus, the son of a guy named Vespasian, who was the new emperor of Rome that came on the heels of the civil war that happened between the Jewish people and the Roman Empire, Titus was sent by his dad to Jerusalem to squash a Jewish rebellion. And as he enters into the city, the well-fortified city, and there's guards and there's people guarding the temple with their life. Josephus, a historian around that time, writes that people were literally laying on their face, trying to prevent Titus and his army from getting into Jerusalem. They were guarding the temple with their life. Titus eventually pushes through, sets the city on fire, and takes out the temple. And what made it so unique, and this is all history, this isn't just the Bible, what makes it so unique is that he didn't just burn the temple. Upon burning the temple, he goes into the temple and sacrifices a sacrifice to the Roman gods, and then gives an order to take every stone from the temple complex and throw it into the valley beside it. Just a number of years after Jesus' prophecy, that exact thing comes to fruition. So some scholars believe that the entire chapter and everything that follows that we're about to cover is only about AD 70, okay? You've got camp number 1 over here. Then you've got a group of people over here that don't believe that this chapter has anything to do with AD 70, and it's all to do with Jesus' second coming. Now, if you encounter a Christian that believes in this being the written word of God, they believe in the second coming, if you're confused about what we believe. All Christians believe, all Christians believe that there's a second coming. Okay, so there's a group of people that believe this chapter is all about the second coming. And then there's a whole other group of people that believe that there's a part about AD 70 and there's a part about the second coming. And then there's another group of people, which is actually where I sit, that this chapter is about the events of AD 70, the second coming, and Jesus' ascension. And what's so significant about us seeing it that way is as we read through the text, and we're just going to skim it today. We don't have time. If we were to go through all of the details, I would literally keep you here till midnight, and no one wants that. But what's so significant about that is Jesus accurately predicts all of the events that happened in AD 70 to a T and gives us clarity that suffering is always going to be a part of our reality on earth. No matter what camp you find yourself in, you can't get away from that piece of the puzzle. In other words, Jesus' prophecy leads us to understand no matter what we believe about it, there are gonna be moments in your life that you're not okay. But the good news of Jesus is that you don't have to be okay to experience God's best. Why? Because God's best is found in God's presence, something that God guaranteed us to have access to both now and forever. So let's fly through just a couple of verses just to have a little bit of fun together. In verse 7, Jesus starts off really, really clear. He says, when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, don't be alarmed. If you're an underlining person, can you just underline, do not be alarmed. A lot of people, every time there's a war somewhere in the world, every time there's a new dictator or a new country or a new conflict in the world, they immediately begin to freak out, thinking that the end is here. Well, what did Jesus say? When the rumors are happening about wars, don't be alarmed. Don't be scared. Don't be anxious. He goes on, such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places and famines, and these are the beginning of birth pains. We're not putting all of this on the screen because it's so much. But we go on to say in verse 9, you must be on your guard, Jesus says. He's saying this to the disciples, you will be handed over to the local councils and flogged in the synagogues, and on account of me, you will stand before governors and kings as witnesses to them. Our pastor talked about on Sunday how that word really begins to translate to the idea of martyr. It's like no one really wants to be a martyr. It's like you'll be a witness, but you don't really want to be a martyr. And Jesus is being really, really honest with them. And he goes on to say, on the account of me, you will stand before governors and kings and witness to them. And the gospel must be preached first to all nations, which I think is such an essential verse in this text that points us to this reality that as Jesus is prophesying, he's following in the way of Old Testament prophets, Jeremiah and Joel and Isaiah and all these people who came in the Old Testament who would always prophesy in the way of they would look at something happening in their immediate circle of what's happening in their immediate time in their world, and they would use that as a lens to look through to see what was coming in the future. You see this in the way that Jeremiah talks about Jesus' arrival, as well as Isaiah. He's like, y'all are gonna, the people of Israel, you're gonna go into exile, but Jesus is gonna come and do a new thing. See how the two are being put together. Jesus is doing the exact same pattern. He's saying there's gonna be wars, there's gonna be turmoil, kingdom's gonna rise against kingdom, and nation's gonna rise against nation, and all of these things are going to happen. And the pain, this pain that I'm referring to and the temple falling, Jesus is saying, it's a birth pain, meaning it's only going to continue. You're going to continue to face this in your time on planet Earth. And the text just continues to go on, where he's talking about all these different things that are gonna happen. But in verse 13, something significant comes out of Jesus' mouth. He says, everyone will hate you because of me, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. And every preacher loves that verse because when they get hate mail, they're like, sweet, I'm living in the way of Jesus. And you gotta think about this just for a second. When you connect all the big ideas that Jesus was talking about in that section, he's saying, be aware, trust me, don't be worried about being okay. And at the end of the day, you can't control what other people think about you. But here's the truth. If you were to picture it this way, if we have a circle of influence and a circle of concern, meaning the circle of influence is everything that you have control over. But the circle of concern is all the things that you're worried about, but you don't have control over. Where do we spend the majority of our time? In the circle of concern, because it's where our worry lies. And it's almost as if Jesus is saying, hey, they're gonna hate you, they're not gonna like you, there's gonna be wars happening that you can't control, there's gonna be dysfunction happening that you can't control. You focus on your circle of influence. You focus on what you can control. You can control your attitude. You can control your words. You can control how you treat other people. You can control what you post on the internet. You can control what gossip you do or you don't engage with. You can control how you treat your boyfriend or girlfriend. You can control all of those things, but you can't control all of these things, and you need to stop trying because this is the pattern of the world. But he continues to point us forward. He talks about an abomination that causes desolation. There's lots of different theories around, is this Titus performing the sacrifice to the Roman gods in the temple? Daniel, the prophet Daniel also talks about this in his book, and a lot of people say that actually happened 150 years before Jesus was even on the earth by another guy who came out of the Maccabean revolt. This whole, I don't have details, or sorry, I don't have time to get into all the details. The point is, Jesus accurately predicted what came next. And as he continues to pull apart this idea, in verse 23, he says, be on your guard again. That's the most repeated idea that's coming out of these paragraphs. Pay attention. He says, I've told you everything ahead of time, but in the following days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light and the stars will fall from the sky and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. And everybody's like, all right, cool. That's where the eclipse comes into play. The eclipse came over the United States yesterday, and those two things are the same. And what Jesus is actually quoting there is Isaiah 13, where Isaiah is talking about the fall of Babylon, and he's using all of this prophetic imagery to illustrate what's coming. But remember the point from the very beginning. Jesus is teaching us there are gonna be some things that fall apart now. There are gonna be some things that fall apart on the way to my second coming. There are gonna be some things that fall apart in the days of my ascension. But here's the point: be on guard. Pay attention. Don't get scared. Don't get fixated on just being okay. And for the sake of time, if we were to zoom all the way down to that section in verse 26, it talks about how people are going to see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory, which I think depicts both his ascension and his redescension, which is mentioned in Acts chapter 1, where the angel comes and comforts the disciples because the disciples are literally standing there. Jesus has just gone into heaven, and they're like, what do we do now? And you got to think, Jesus in that moment was like, I just taught you for the past 3 years what to do. Like, go do it. And an angel comes down, taps him on the shoulder, and is like, hey, he's going to return the same exact way that he just left. And I think Jesus is painting this picture for us. I'm coming again. I'm going to redeem everything. You're going to know God's best for all of eternity because I love you. And at the very end of the section, if you grew up in church, you've heard the section about no one knows the day or the hour that Jesus is returning. And Jesus points to that in Mark 13. He tells a story about if an owner of a house leaves and leaves his servants in charge, when he comes back, he wants them to be prepared for them. And in verse 36, he says something that we should all pay close attention to. It says, if he comes suddenly, because no one knows when Jesus is coming back. No one knows. So it's unfair for us to act like we do know, if I can just be honest with you. No one knows the day or the hour. Jesus even says he doesn't know in this moment. So just playing this out for a second, if Jesus doesn't know, then we don't know. Because I feel like Jesus would know before we know, right? But the point in verse 36, he says, if he comes suddenly, do not let him find you sleeping. What I say to you, I say to everyone, watch, look, pay attention. Don't get fixated on self-preservation. Don't get fixated on trying to be okay. Don't get fixated on carrying around the things that make you feel temporarily okay at the expense of experiencing God's best, which is available to you in all of the prophecy, and all of the hurt, and all of the suffering, and all of the pain that you may or may not experience in this life. The temporary things that we hold, they're not going to measure up. They're not going to sustain us. We've got to take our cue from linen. We've got to throw it out of the crib. Sorry, linen. And I think when you think about, well, how do I live into God's presence? I think that is such an important question. And I think Paul gives us an answer to it in 1 Corinthians 13. So if you have your Bible, let's turn there really, really quick. We're going to leave Mark 13, and we're going to 1 Corinthians 13. I just noticed the connection. And Paul, writing to the church in Corinth, it's one of 4 different letters that he wrote. We're going to put this on the back wall because I want to show you a couple things. We're going to do this really quick. And then we're going to land our time together. But as he's writing to them, one thing to know about Paul is Paul was in the boat that he was absolutely convinced that Jesus ascended. He was absolutely convinced that Jesus was coming again. He writes about it in all of his different letters. He actually writes about it and uses what Jesus says in Mark chapter 13 in a letter that he wrote to the church in Thessalonica, which is actually one of the ways that we know that Mark wrote his account of what Jesus said before the temple was destroyed, which validates Jesus' knowledge and understanding of what was going to happen in the future beautifully. It's so clear that a lot of historians and a lot of scholars try to late date the Gospels, but because we have Thessalonians, we actually know that there's no way that that would actually be reality. Sorry, I am geeking out right now, and I am sorry that I am dragging you through it. But here we go, 1 Corinthians 13, let's land this thing together. Paul talking, it's a 13-verse chapter, and it's packed full of so much good understanding about what it looks like to move from accepting the status quo, stop accepting the okay version of life by the world's standards, and move into God's best. He says, if I speak in the tongues of men or angels, but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. In other words, if I just do what's right, if I just check they're telling me to plug it in. Hello. How's everybody doing? How we doing? I used to be on production. I know what to do.
There it is. We got you, bro.
Whoa, ha, ha, ha. That was the goofiest laugh ever. 1 Corinthians 13, and verse 1. This thing does weird things to you. If I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, but do not have love, I'm only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. Paul's saying, if I just say all the right things and I say all them in the right way, but I don't do them with love, then I'm just a resounding gong. I'm just a clanging cymbal. But just look for just a second at the word love. I'm still trying to figure this thing out. Think about it through the lens of what the writer of 1 John says, that God is love, inherently. So all of these things that Paul is about to describe about love are also true about God. So in other words, but if I do all these things, I speak all these things, and I don't have God, if I'm not living in God's presence, I'm just a resounding gong, and I'm just a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom mysteries and knowledge, if I have faith that can move mountains, but I don't have love, I'm nothing. If I do all these great things and I don't have God, if I'm not living into God's best version of reality, I have nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and give over my body to hardship that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. He's saying, okay isn't good enough. He goes on, and this is the famous passage that pastors read at weddings all the time. I've done it. I'll do it at yours too. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. God is patient. God is kind. God does not envy. God does not boast. Are you patient? When was the last time that you just absolutely lost your cool? You're like, I'm over it. I'm tired of waiting. I'm tired of waiting, God. I need that person now. God's saying, as you step into my presence, you're going to learn that love is patient. It's kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It's not proud. It does not dishonor others. It's not self-seeking. It's not easily angered. And now at this point, we're all offended, right? Because he's getting in all of our space. It keeps no record of wrongs, including the dishes in the sink that your roommate refuses to do, that you're keeping a note on your phone to prove at the end of the year why you're not going to be their roommate. Sorry. Whoa, that got personal. Let's jump back into the text. Love does not delight in evil, but it rejoices with the truth that you haven't been doing your dishes. Sorry, but love, God does not delight in evil. God rejoices with the truth that his presence is best for you. It always protects, it always trusts, it always hopes, and it always perseveres. Watch this. God always protects, even in the midst of earthly suffering. God always trusts. God always hopes. God always perseveres because he embodies true agape love. Love never fails. But where there are prophecies, they will cease. Now he's getting into some really interesting things. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For I know in part, this is us right here. We don't know everything, which is why there's so much debate. If you were to go back to all of the different people's interpretation of that text, there's a lot of things about Jesus' second coming. There's a lot of things about earth. There's a lot of things about God that we don't fully understand, that we fully can't grasp right now. And Paul's saying, though I know these things in part, or though we know these things in part, or we prophesy in part. But then, when completeness comes, watch this, what is in part disappears. In other words, the need for things that make you feel temporarily okay, you're not gonna need them anymore. You're not even going to be tempted with them anymore because you're going to be dwelling in God's presence for eternity. Sorry, this is the weirdest looking giraffe on the planet. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. But when I became a man, I put on, sorry, I can't not read it that way. I put on, Paul's gonna be upset with me when I get to heaven. It's gonna be okay. I put the ways of childhood behind me. I put the naive thinking that the temporary things of this world being things that are going to satisfy me, I put them behind me because I recognize that I don't understand the whole picture. And here's where he lands the plane. For now, right here, in his day and in our day, we only see a reflection as in a mirror. But then, when we meet God face to face, or when Jesus comes back for the second time, we shall see face to face. And now, I know in part, but then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And then he gives the famous line, and these three remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. It's almost like he's giving us a roadmap to God's presence. You can't get to God's presence on your own terms. The only way that you get to experience God's best for you is by having faith that there is a better version for you and that its origin is God. When you think about hope, hope is really just the decision that you're gonna act prematurely on something that you don't know for sure, which is why we put our hope in Jesus. We don't see everything about Jesus. We don't know everything about the end times. We don't know everything about these details, but our hope is in the arrival of Jesus. And then you think about love, the very thing that God poured out for us, for all of us, that we could just come to him and be his beloved, even in the midst of unimaginable suffering. That in the middle of the chaos, as Jesus was talking about, as they were being flogged in synagogues, he said, don't worry about what you're gonna say when you get there. The Spirit will give you the words to use. Which makes what he says in John 15 so significant. When he says, it's better that I leave so that the Spirit will come. I've always wondered why that's better. Here's why. Because the Spirit gets to dwell in everybody at the same time. Which means that what happens in Psalm 84 is so significant. Because the psalmist, the sons of Korah, these people that David had around the temple, says in verse 1, how lovely is your dwelling place, Lord Almighty. God chose to dwell in us through the work of Jesus on the cross. The whole book of Acts is this story about the Spirit of God leading God's church. Thousands of years before that moment, the sons of Korah are declaring in and around the tabernacle that how lovely is your dwelling place. It's the best place to be. There's nowhere better. Why? Because God's there. And God exudes love in every way and empowers us to live faith-filled and hope-filled lives that are not mediocre, that are not focused on just being okay, that are focused on God's best. And the heat really gets turned up in verse 10. It's a famous line, and we're about to sing it together. But it says, better is one day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere. And that is so convicting and so beautiful all at the same time. Because it's clear as day in the text. And it's clear as day in what Jesus is prophesying about the future. It's clear as day in what Paul's talking about to his letter to the church in Corinth. That there is no better place for you to be and for me to be than in the presence of God, no matter what's happening around us. So whatever's keeping us comfortable, whatever's making us just feel okay, it's got to go. Because there's no better place to be than in the dwelling place of God. Because God's best is always found in God's presence. So Jesus, we thank you for the work of the cross. We thank you for your love for us. We thank you for your hope that you give us so gently and so completely. God, we thank you that it's true. That better is one day with you than 1,000 elsewhere. And that your dwelling place, it's unlike any other. And God, I pray that we would trust you in that. That we would take you up on your offer and we would come and bow at your feet and experience you. And God, I pray that we would bring every good thing and every hard thing, every area of suffering and every area of celebration, and that we would lay them at your feet. And that we would trust that as we encounter you, we will experience the best version of life, no matter what. God, we love you, and we say this in your name. Amen. I invite you to stand where you are. And as we sing this song, some of you have heard it before, maybe some of you have never heard it before. It's a pretty simple melody, but I hope that it sticks in your heart. And we're just singing the Bible over the next few moments. We're singing straight out of Psalm 84. And I just hope and pray that we can declare it with a great deal of faith, a great deal of hope, and a great deal of love.